Welcome back to the ProWorks channel. My name is John. I want to show you guys how I flatten boards that are too wide for my joiner. I use a planer sled method, which is pretty common, and so you can see how this board has a noticeable rock. And what I like to do is take some thin shims, and I'll put one in this corner, which is a low spot or a high spot, whichever way you look at it. It gets rid of the rock here, but if I go to the back corner, there's still a rock there. So I'll add another shim there, and that'll get rid of the rock. And now that I have the shims, I can transfer these pieces to the actual sled, which in my case is just a piece of melamine shelving. I've got it ripped down so that it fits into my planer. It's about 12 inches wide. I have a cleat attached to the back, just screwed in, and here I'm adding a cleat to the front. And these two cleats will prevent the board from being pushed back or forward when it's going through the planer. Initially, I want to take pretty light passes, so I'm just raising the planer up so that it's just slightly skimming material off the top. After that, I can assess if it's taking off the high spots correctly. After a few passes, you can see that it took material off in this lower right corner and this upper left corner, and those correspond to where the shims are, which is just raising the material up, which is exactly what you want. And I'll keep taking light passes until I get a fully smooth surface. If you started with a smooth surface that was warped, just use a pencil and mark the surface, and once you get rid of the pencil lines, you should be good to go. Here's the board on my flat workbench, and you can see the side that was face down on the sled is still rocking, but we go to the side that I was actually planing, and now there is no more rock. And now I can take it back to the planer with the plane side down and get the board fully flat and parallel. This project is actually a birthday present for my niece, who's a huge Harry Potter fan. This is a take on the small Deathly Hallows engagement ring boxes that I make and sell. This is going to be a jewelry or keepsake box, and it's going to have an epoxy and stone inlay. Shown here is a 3/16 inch spiral bit that's doing the inlay, and it's about 1/8 of an inch deep. And after this, I'm cutting the outer shape of the triangle, and I'm only going to go about a 1/2 inch deep here, and I'll do the rest with a flush trim bit. I'm using some crushed stone that I bought on Etsy, and I've done a couple smaller boxes with this stone, and it works really well. I start out by filling the engraving with the stone, and this gives me a rough starting point for how much material I'll need. I know I'm going to add epoxy to it later, but I want to know that I have enough material so that I don't run out when I'm filling it up. And this is obviously the best way to get random pieces of sawdust mixed in with your expensive stone inlay. This West Systems epoxy works pretty well. I learned that you need to have a pretty high ratio of stone to epoxy because you want to have a thick substance to pour the inlay in. Otherwise, the epoxy will float and the stone will sink, which is not the look that I was after. I don't know what the exact ratio is, but I would say it's at least 2-to-1 stone to epoxy. And you can see as I'm pouring the epoxy and stone mix here that it's pretty viscous, and that also makes it harder to pour than if it was just a regular liquid like water. I did my best to make sure that most of the material got into the actual engraving itself. I come back later and I'm just spreading it around, making sure that there's no low spots. If anything, you want high spots because that'll make the bubbles float to those high spots, and you can just sand them away later. The last step here before I let it set overnight is to get rid of any air bubbles with a torch. I found the best way to get rid of this excess material is with a belt sander. I'm using a 50 grit belt here, and it does a pretty good job. I can switch to a 60 grit pad on my orbital sander after this. You could try running this through your planer, though I don't think the stone will be particularly nice to your knives. I think the epoxy by itself would be okay, but the stone just adds a level of hardness to the material that could damage your knives pretty easily. I revealed some bubbles that I wasn't able to get rid of, so I like to use CA glue to fill them in. I'll let that dry and sand it back, and if there's any more that I wasn't able to get rid of, I'll just repeat the process. For the bottom half of the jewelry box, I'm using the CNC router to do some of the pocket operations to create the compartments that the jewelry box will have. This was the most efficient method I had, especially with the workflow I had going on at the time, and I had a couple projects going, so this was the easiest method for me. There's two reasons I didn't have the CNC operation cut all the way through this piece. The first being it just takes longer, and I would have to insert tabs in the operation. It just makes it a little bit more complicated. The second reason is I want to have that extra material on the side so that my belt sander and orbital sander don't wander and create a pillow effect on the edges of the piece. This is the first time I was actually using this bit. It's the same one from the Sam Maloof coffee table video. I got this bit for that table, but it came in handy for this build as well. I kept going back and forth on how I wanted the box to open. I know hinges are an obvious choice, but I was also considering having a dowel in one corner and having the top swivel open, being secured by magnets. I realized that the hinges gave me the option to have more vertical storage in the box, so I went with those. These are Brusso hinges, which are pretty fun to use because they're really nice, high quality. I use a router and an 1/8 inch spiral bit to get rid of a bulk of the material, and then I'll come back with a chisel to square everything up. Here I'm just transferring my lines to the top piece so that all the hinges line up correctly, and I'll just rinse and repeat with the router and chisel. I used a Vicks bit to make sure that the holes were drilled properly and centered within the hinges, and then I came back with a regular drill bit to deepen those holes. After that, I could thread the holes with the steel screw that is provided. This is just so that you don't break any of the brass screws trying to thread this material. I knew using hinges would leave me with the issue of how to keep this box shut. Having a point at the front doesn't really give you a good spot to add a latch unless you want an asymmetrical look, which I wasn't after. You could also use magnets, but I thought that it would be difficult to find a middle ground of something that wasn't too weak and wasn't too strong to pull apart. So I found this little snap closure on Lee Valley's website when I was ordering the hinges. It's got a little brass piece that inserts into the top, and the other half is a little piece of plastic that connects with the little brass tip. I found that it's a pretty decent strength. It will hold itself together, but it's also not too difficult to open. After adding an 1/8 inch roundover to all the edges and sanding to 320, I added 3 coats of Danish oil to the box. As usual, I like to add a heavy coat, let it sit for a few minutes, and then wipe it completely dry with a clean paper towel. After letting it sit for a few hours, I'll come back and add a second and third coat. I used 5-minute epoxy to secure the snap closure, but you want to make sure to use a really light amount of epoxy because you don't want any squeeze out and you don't want any of the epoxy to get into the middle of this snap closure mechanism. Here you can see the box itself. It's got a couple compartments to hold jewelry and little keepsakes. I wanted to show you the simple method I use for joining wide boards. I know it's nothing that I invented, but it is simple enough and I hope you learned something from it. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Thanks for watching.